Hello, a pleasant day to each and everyone. I am Bulay Bulay Allen, and together with my group mates, Gabi Annalisa, Talarag Andrea Carla, Buhian Angeline, Simbahan Ann Carmela, Pahayak Arnie, and Bahian Sainian Alet, we are going to discuss one of the macro skills, which is the listening. So now, let me share you a quote that is relevant to our discussion for today. Listening means taking a second to consider what they are saying, not just hearing their words. Sometimes we tend to listen in order to respond, and we forget that we should listen in order to understand what the speaker was trying to say. So now, before we proceed to our proper discussion, let me ask you first some questions. How often do you listen to radio or news and television? How often do you watch documentaries on social media? Or should we say, how often do you engage in a conversation? What macro skill do you use in this kind of situation? Yes, you are definitely right. In this kind of situations, we use our listening skills. So when we say listening, it is the most basic language skill which is consistently interrelated and intertwined with the other language skills such as the speaking, reading, as well as writing. So this is a communication technique that requires the learner to understand, to interpret, and of course to evaluate what he or she hears. And now let's proceed to teaching listening comprehension. So as you can observe, there is a short scenario showing that there are people who lack listening skills. And here it goes. 3 people were on a train in England. As they approached what appeared to be Wimberley Station, one of the travelers said, "Is this Wimberley?" The second passenger then replied, "No, it's Thursday." Whereupon, the third person remarked, "Oh, I am too. Let's have a drink." So in this scenario, it simply reflects that people in this context has poor listening skills. However, we can say that there are instances that hinders effective communication, such as psychological barriers, physical barriers, and many others. So why does listening is the most important macro skill in language learning? So importance of listening in language learning can hardly be overestimated. Like it is much larger, it is very broad skill that we need to develop. So through reception, we internalize linguistic information without which we could not produce language. So when we say reception, when we say reception or receptive listening, it is the ability to receive the speaker's message as well as to interpret it using our knowledge and understanding of the language. So listening awakens awareness of the language, as it is a receptive skill that first develops in a human being. Let's say, for instance, in a classroom setting, wherein the teacher discusses the lesson and then the students or the learners will always do more listening than speaking. Have you observed that? So listening competence is universally larger than speaking competence. Why is that? It is because in listening, it gives them more attention. They completely comprehend the deepest details that teachers taught them. So is it any wonder, or have you observed also, that in recent years, the language teaching profession has placed concerted emphasis on listening comprehension? Unlike before, unlike the traditional educational system, listening is now fully integrated into the curriculum, and educators draw attention and give an emphasis on listening comprehension for the students or for the learners. However, there are times that we have a natural tendency to look at speaking as the major index of language proficiency. Like, for instance, consider, for example, our commonly used query. Do you speak Japanese or do you speak Korean? Of course, we don't mean to exclude comprehension when we say that. But when we think of foreign language learning, we first think of speaking. So way back then, in the decades of the 1950s and 60s, language teaching methodology was preoccupied with the spoken language, as classrooms full of students could be heard performing their oral drills. Like, learners are tasked to recite, to memorize, and perform a certain poem or any other language text without even understanding what was the meaning of it. And exactly, it was not uncommon for students to orally practice phrases they did not even understand. However, today, listening is progressive because of the new strategies contributing to effective listening, and moreover, the widespread availability of technology supports the language learners in enhancing their listening skills. And now let's proceed to listening comprehension and pedagogical research. So, listening is, as we all know, a major component in language learning and teaching. So, learning to listen to the target language improves language ability. So, James Asher's work on a total physical response first hit the spotlight in the late 1970s. So, total physical response, it is based on the coordination of language and physical movement. So, in TPR, instructors give commands to students in the target language with body movements. And of course, students respond with whole body actions. So, the role of comprehension was given prominence as learners were given great quantities of language to listen to before they were encouraged to respond orally. So, how can we use TPR in classroom or in a classroom setting? So, here are the basic method in using TPR in classroom. So first, the teacher performs an action. The teacher performs an action both demonstrating and saying it. Like, for example, I'm washing my hands. So the teacher should be prepared to exaggerate, to use gestures, facial expressions, and props if necessary. And then the second method we have here, the teacher will then going to call on the students to repeat the action or to repeat the action of the teacher. And then they will going to repeat it once more and write the verb or phrase on the board, and the teacher must also return to them regularly during the semester to check the learner's retention. So similar to total physical response is the natural approach, which was developed by Dr. Stephen Krashen and Tracy Terrell. They recommended a significant silent period during which learners were allowed the security often listening without being forced to go through the anxiety of speaking before they were ready to do so. Like, for instance, the teacher shows a set of pictures, let's say, for example, verbs, repeating the word that goes with each with one. So the students would just simply watch and listen to the teacher. So here, the learners are not forced to utter words or phrases, much less pronounce them correctly. There are no endless drills on correct usage, no mentions of grammar rules or long list of vocabulary to memorize. So there's no hurry or worry in the learning of the learners. By continuously exposing the learners to the language, like to how it is used in different situations, and by giving them meaningful and memorable inputs, like teaching them about verbs, a spontaneous emergence of speech happens. Such approaches were an outgrowth of a variety of research studies that showed evidence of the importance of input in second language acquisition. Stephen Krushen, for example, he borrowed insights from first language acquisition, which stressed that the significance of comprehensible input. So the comprehensible input theory states that second language learners need to be exposed to linguistic input that is just slightly above their current language level so that they can understand the new input. And about the same time, researchers were also stressing the crucial importance of whatever mental processes were brought on the learners converting input into intake, or that which is actually stored in a learner's competence. So in other words, you can be exposed to great quantities of input, but what counts is the linguistic information that you ultimately glean from that exposure through conscious and subconscious attention, through cognitive strategies of retention, through feedback, and of course, through your interaction. So, the conversion of input into intake is absolutely crucial in considering the role of listening in language learning. So, those input that learners are exposed to will be converted into intake, which the learner comprehends and acts on to develop his or her internal grammar of the target language and its roles of use. So here, teachers might ask their students about they have taken in from perhaps a whole array of comprehensive or comprehension activity, considering the role of listening techniques utilized in class. This issue prompts teachers to consider some specific questions about listening comprehension. Number 1, what are listeners doing when they listen? What factors affect good listening? What are the characteristics of real-life listening? What are the many things listeners listen for? What are some principles of designing listening techniques? How can listening techniques be interactive? And lastly, what are some common techniques for teaching listening? So to conclude with my discussion, without listening, language learning is difficult and it is impossible to achieve. These and other related questions will be addressed in this chapter.